Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
Important. Highcroft Lodge stood upon the rise above the village like an aging aristocrat who had fallen upon quieter times but refused to admit it. Its tall windows overlooked the winding lanes of St. Mary Mead, and from the terrace one could see the church spire rising beyond the autumn trees. On the evening of the village music recital, the lodge glowed warmly with candlelight and conversation. Mrs. Celeste Armitage, owner of Highcroft Lodge and patroness of nearly every respectable village event, had opened her drawing room for the occasion. Chairs had been arranged in careful rows near the piano, silver trays of cakes and sherry rested upon side tables, and the air carried the mingled scents of polish, roses, and wood smoke. Miss Marple sat near the rear window with her knitting folded neatly beside her. She appeared entirely occupied with listening to the curate's niece perform a hesitant piece by Chopin, though her eyes moved quietly around the room. There was Mr. Julian Armitage, Celeste's stepson, handsome and restless near the fireplace. There was Dr. Fenwick speaking in low tones to the housekeeper. And there was Miss Lydia Gray, who had arrived late and now seemed determined not to meet anyone's eyes directly. Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple during the applause. "My dear," she whispered, "Lydia Gray looks positively ill." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Fear is very exhausting." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Fear? Of what?" Miss Marple's mild blue eyes drifted briefly toward the far end of the drawing room, where Celeste Armitage stood beside the piano smiling graciously at her guests. "Oh," she murmured gently, "that is usually the interesting question. At 9:30, after the final performance ended, Mrs. Armitage announced that coffee would be served in the conservatory overlooking the gardens. The guests rose gradually, conversations resuming with relieved enthusiasm now that the music had concluded. During the movement between rooms, no one noticed immediately that Julian Armitage had disappeared, nor did anyone pay much attention when Lydia Gray slipped quietly toward the corridor leading to the library. The first sign that something was wrong came from the housemaid. She entered the conservatory pale and visibly shaken. "Mrs. Armitage," she whispered urgently, "there's someone in the library." The room fell abruptly silent. Celeste Armitage frowned. "What do you mean?" The maid swallowed nervously. I think he's dead." For one suspended moment no one moved. Then chairs scraped violently against the tiled floor as the guests hurried toward the corridor. The library door stood half open. Inside, beneath the green-shaded reading lamp, Julian Armitage lay motionless beside the desk. One hand remained stretched toward the fireplace as though he had been reaching for support. A crystal decanter had shattered across the carpet nearby. Miss Lydia Gray stood near the doorway, white as paper. "I found him," she whispered faintly. "I only came to return a book." No one answered her. Miss Marple remained slightly apart from the others, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. Her eyes moved quietly across the room, the broken decanter, the overturned chair, the untouched fire burning low in the grate. Then her gaze settled briefly upon the clock on the mantelpiece. "How curious," she murmured softly. Mrs. Bantry stared at her in disbelief. "My dear, a man has just been murdered." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Important. And someone has already begun arranging the scene." "Important." For several minutes after the discovery, confusion spread through Highcroft Lodge with astonishing speed. Guests crowded the corridor outside the library, whispering anxiously while trying unsuccessfully to see inside. The earlier warmth of the recital had vanished completely, replaced by a strained silence broken only by hurried footsteps and frightened speculation. Dr. Fenwick reached the body first. He knelt beside Julian Armitage with professional calm, though his expression darkened almost immediately. The green-shaded lamp cast an uneven glow across the library, illuminating the broken glass scattered over the carpet and the dark stain slowly spreading near Julian's shoulder. At last the doctor rose slowly. "He's dead," he said quietly. Mrs. Celeste Armitage gripped the doorframe for support. "No," she whispered. "No, that cannot be true." Dr. Fenwick removed his spectacles with visible discomfort. "I am afraid there is nothing to be done." The announcement settled over the room like a sudden weight. Lydia Gray remained near the doorway, pale and trembling. She looked less shocked than terrified, as though the sight before her had confirmed some private fear already long established in her mind. Inspector Bartlett from Much Benham was sent immediately, though everyone knew there would be some delay before he arrived. Until then, the guests lingered uneasily throughout the drawing-room and conservatory, unable either to leave or remain calm. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fire with Mrs. Bantry, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry whispered nervously, "what could possibly have happened?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the library corridor. "Something emotional, I think," she replied softly, "but also something hurried." "Mrs. Important." Bantry frowned. "Hurried?" "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "People who act in sudden distress rarely leave rooms entirely natural afterward. They straighten things without realizing it." At that moment, Celeste Armitage entered the drawing-room looking visibly strained but determined to maintain control. "I must ask everyone to remain here until the inspector arrives," she said quietly. "I know this is distressing, but it cannot be helped." Colonel Havers nodded grimly. "Quite right." The housemaid brought brandy for Lydia Gray, who accepted it with trembling hands. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances in her direction. Mrs. Finch lowered her voice immediately. "She found the body." "Yes," murmured another guest. "And she looked terrified before any of this happened." Miss Marple appeared not to hear them. Instead, her attention remained fixed upon the library door itself. Something about it troubled her. Not the obvious detailist broken decanter or overturned chair, but something quieter, something arranged. Inspector Bartlett arrived shortly before 11. He was a compact, practical man with sharp grey eyes and a manner suggesting little patience for melodrama. After a brief conversation with Dr. Fenwick, he entered the library alone. The room had remained untouched since the discovery. Julian Armitage lay beside the desk exactly as before, one arm stretched awkwardly toward the fireplace. The decanter fragments glittered beneath the lamplight like scattered ice. Inspector Bartlett studied the room in silence. "No weapon?" he asked finally. Dr. Fenwick shook his head. "None visible." "And death? A blow to the head, most likely. Possibly from a blunt object." The inspector crouched near the body carefully. "Important." His eyes moved from the broken decanter to the desk, then toward the fireplace. "Struggle?" "Brief, perhaps," said the doctor. "Nothing extensive." Inspector Bartlett straightened slowly. "And the body was discovered by Miss Gray?" "Yes," replied Celeste Armitage from the doorway. The inspector glanced toward Lydia, who sat rigidly near the drawing-room entrance. "I shall need to speak with her shortly." Miss Marple entered the library quietly at that moment, moving with her usual harmless calm. Inspector Bartlett acknowledged her with mild impatience. "You observed something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, no," she replied pleasantly. "Only ordinary little details." The inspector gave a faint sigh. "And which details are those?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the mantel clock. It stopped at 9:23. Inspector Bartlett looked up sharply. "Yes," he said cautiously. "Likely damage during the struggle." "Perhaps." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Though the clock itself appears perfectly untouched." The inspector frowned slightly. Miss Marple continued softly, "And there is another curious thing. The decanter shattered near the desk, yet the wine upon the carpet has spread beneath the chair rather evenly." She paused gently, almost as though the chair was moved afterward. Inspector Bartlett looked toward the overturned chair immediately. "You believe the scene was disturbed?" "Oh, yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "but only a little, just enough to encourage a particular impression." The inspector folded his arms thoughtfully. "What impression?" Miss Marple glanced quietly around the library. "That there was chaos here," she replied softly. "When in fact, the room feels surprisingly controlled." A silence settled briefly between them. "Important." Then Inspector Bartlett looked again toward the stopped clock. 9:23. A precise moment. Too precise, perhaps. Outside in the drawing-room, Lydia Gray sat staring into the fire with visible dread while the other guests whispered cautiously around her. "And Miss Marple, watching her quietly through the open doorway, felt suddenly certain of one thing. Lydia Gray feared something far worse than suspicion. She feared the truth itself. Important. Inspector Bartlett began his questioning shortly after midnight, determined to establish a clear sequence of events before memory and gossip had further opportunity to distort them. The guests remained gathered uneasily throughout the drawing room, where half-finished coffee cups and abandoned music sheets now seemed oddly ghost-like beneath the soft lamplight. Lydia Gray was questioned first. She entered the small morning room pale and visibly exhausted, though she held herself with careful composure. Inspector Bartlett observed immediately that she appeared less concerned about being accused than about saying the wrong thing. "You discovered the body?" he asked calmly. "Yes." "At what time?" "At what time? I am not certain exactly. You left the conservatory alone?" "Yes." "I wish to return a book to the library shelf before leaving." Inspector Bartlett made a note. "And when you entered the room?" Lydia hesitated faintly. The lamp was already on. "I saw Mr. Armitage lying beside the desk. Did you touch anything?" "No." "Did you see anyone leaving the corridor beforehand?" Again she hesitated. "I thought I heard footsteps earlier." The inspector looked up sharply. "Earlier?" "Yes. Shortly before I entered the library. Man or woman?" "I couldn't tell." Inspector Bartlett watched her steadily. "You appear frightened, Miss Gray." Her fingers tightened around one another. "It has been a dreadful evening." "Yes," he agreed quietly, "but I suspect your fear began before tonight." For a brief moment something flickered across her face, panic perhaps, or recognition. Then it vanished. "I don't know what you mean." Inspector Bartlett let the silence stretch uncomfortably before dismissing her. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat quietly beside the conservatory windows with Mrs. Bantry. Outside, the gardens of Highcroft Lodge lay dark beneath drifting autumn mist. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry whispered anxiously, "that poor girl looks terrified." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured softly, "though not entirely because of murder." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Then why?" Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "People who fear scandal often react more strongly than people who fear death itself." At that moment, Inspector Bartlett entered the conservatory and approached Celeste Armitage. "Mrs. Armitage, I understand your stepson handled some estate matters." Celeste looked tired suddenly. "Some. Though Julian was not particularly responsible. And your relationship was harmonious." A faint pause followed. "As harmonious as possible." Inspector Bartlett noticed it immediately. "Meaning?" Celeste lowered her eyes briefly. "Julian could be difficult. He resented authority. And financially, he was frequently in debt." The inspector made another note. "Did he quarrel with anyone recently?" "Yes." Her voice tightened slightly. "With nearly everyone." Across the room, Colonel Havers gave a low grunt of agreement. Inspector Bartlett turned toward him at once. "You knew the victim well?" "For years." "And you also argued with him?" The colonel's expression hardened. "Julian borrowed money carelessly and insulted people freely. So yes." Inspector Bartlett studied him thoughtfully. Anger seemed abundant at Highcroft Lodge. Too abundant, perhaps. Back in the library, Miss Marple stood quietly near the desk while Dr. Fenwick examined the broken decanter more closely. "One strange thing," the doctor murmured. "There's remarkably little blood on the glass itself." Miss Marple glanced toward him. "You expected more?" "If the decanter caused the injury, yes." "Important." Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the fireplace. "How interesting." Inspector Bartlett re-entered the room. "Another inconsistency." "Possibly," Dr. Fenwick replied. "The decanter may have been broken afterward rather than during the attack." The inspector's expression sharpened immediately. "Staged?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think several things in this room were arranged afterward." Inspector Bartlett looked toward the stopped clock once more. 9:23. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "A very convenient moment." The inspector frowned slightly. "You still doubt the clock stopped naturally." Miss Marple moved slowly toward the mantelpiece. People become surprisingly dramatic when trying to construct believable scenes. Stopped clocks are very theatrical. Inspector Bartlett folded his arms. You think someone deliberately adjusted it? Perhaps not adjusted, Miss Marple replied gently, but encouraged. She touched the edge of the clock lightly. There is dust disturbed here. The inspector stepped closer immediately. A handprint? More likely someone is steadying themselves. Miss Marple paused softly. Or moving the clock intentionally. A silence settled over the library. Then Inspector Bartlett said quietly, if the time was falsified, then the entire sequence becomes uncertain. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, which is usually the point. At that moment the housemaid entered nervously carrying a folded shawl. I found this near the terrace doors, sir. Inspector Bartlett took it carefully. The shawl belonged to Lydia Gray. Everyone in the room fell silent. It was outside, the inspector asked sharply. Yes, sir. Near the garden steps. Miss Marple's eyes lifted slowly toward the dark terrace beyond the glass. Important. Lydia Gray had claimed she went directly from the conservatory to the library. Yet now her shawl had appeared outside. Inspector Bartlett's expression hardened immediately. She lied about her movements. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, but lies are curious things. One must always ask whether people lie to conceal guilt or simply to conceal something else entirely. Her gaze drifted thoughtfully toward the mist-covered gardens, and for the first time since Julian Armitage's death, she felt the shape of the mystery beginning quietly to shift beneath the surface appearances. Important. The discovery of Lydia Gray's shawl near the terrace doors altered the direction of suspicion almost immediately. By breakfast the following morning, whispers moved quietly through Highcroft Lodge that Miss Gray must have concealed part of her movements on the night of the murder. Lydia herself appeared increasingly strained beneath the growing attention. She remained pale and withdrawn throughout breakfast, barely touching her tea while the other guests exchanged cautious glances over polished silver and untouched toast. Inspector Bartlett arrived shortly after 9, determined to press the matter further. You told me, he said calmly once Lydia had been brought into the morning room again, that you went directly from the conservatory to the library. Yes, and yet your shawl was found outside near the terrace. Lydia's hands tightened instantly. I must have dropped it earlier. Earlier when? She hesitated visibly. 2 went outside briefly before coffee. Inspector Bartlett's eyes narrowed slightly. Why did you fail to mention that? Lydia lowered her gaze. Because I knew how it would appear afterward. The inspector leaned back slowly. And how would it appear? That I was hiding something? A silence settled between them. Were you? Lydia looked exhausted suddenly. Yes, she whispered. Inspector Bartlett waited, but instead of continuing she pressed one trembling hand against her forehead and turned away. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window with her knitting, observed her thoughtfully. Not the silence of guilt, she reflected, the silence of shame. Inspector Bartlett's voice softened slightly. Miss Gray, did you meet Julian Armitage outside last night? Lydia closed her eyes briefly. Yes, the answer landed heavily in the room. Important. For what purpose? He asked me to. And you agreed? Yes. Inspector Bartlett studied her carefully. Why? A faint flush rose in Lydia's cheeks. Because he threatened me. The inspector's expression sharpened immediately. Threatened you how? Lydia remained silent for several seconds before answering quietly. Julian had letters. Old letters written years ago. Her voice tightened painfully. He said if I refused to see him he would show them publicly. Miss Marple's needles paused softly. Ah, she thought. Now we arrive at the truly human part. Inspector Bartlett folded his arms. And what occurred during this meeting? We argued. Lydia swallowed hard. He had been drinking. He became angry when I told him the letters no longer mattered. Did anyone witness this? I don't think so. And afterward? I left him near the terrace and returned inside. Alive? Yes, the answer came instantly. Inspector Bartlett watched her steadily. And you went nowhere near the library afterward until discovering the body? Lydia hesitated only slightly. Yes. The inspector did not entirely believe her. Meanwhile, Miss Marple wandered quietly through the library once more while Dr. Fenwick examined the mantel clock more carefully. "It was definitely interfered with," the doctor murmured. "The mechanism isn't damaged naturally." Inspector Bartlett looked up sharply. "So someone stopped it deliberately?" "Yes." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very theatrical." The inspector gave a short sigh. "You seem remarkably unimpressed by dramatic murder scenes, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she replied softly. "I simply find them suspicious. Real violence is usually much less tidy." Important. Her gaze drifted toward the shattered decanter still resting upon the side table where the fragments had been collected. "There is another curious thing," she added gently. Inspector Bartlett looked at her expectantly. "The decanter. What about it?" "It was an expensive crystal, extremely delicate." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yet it shattered very completely." The inspector frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning it was likely thrown downward rather forcefully rather than dropped accidentally during a struggle." A silence settled briefly across the room. Inspector Bartlett's expression darkened thoughtfully. "So the broken glass may have been staged separately from the attack itself." "Yes." "And the clock stopped." "Yes." The inspector looked slowly around the library. "Someone worked quite hard to create a dramatic scene." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Which usually means they wish us to notice the drama rather than the truth." At that moment Colonel Havers entered abruptly carrying a folded newspaper. "Inspector," he said grimly, "there's something else you should know." Inspector Bartlett turned sharply. "What is it?" The colonel hesitated. "Julian Armitage planned to leave Highcroft Lodge permanently." A silence followed. Celeste Armitage, standing near the doorway, looked genuinely startled. "What?" Colonel Havers nodded heavily. "He told me yesterday afternoon. Said he intended to take money from the estate settlement and disappear abroad within the month." Inspector Bartlett's attention sharpened immediately. "And who stood to lose from that decision?" The colonel glanced briefly toward Celeste before answering carefully. "Several people, perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes moved quietly from one face to another. "Interesting," she thought. "Important. Very interesting indeed. Because sudden departures often exposed hidden dependencies." Inspector Bartlett resumed calmly. "Did Julian mention any quarrel connected to this plan?" "Yes." Colonel Havers hesitated faintly. "He said someone at the lodge would never allow him to leave quietly." A heavy silence settled over the room. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the terrace windows beyond which the gardens stretched pale beneath the autumn light. The false clock, the arranged decanter, the secret meeting. And now a threatened departure. No, she reflected quietly. This murder was not simply about blackmail or scandal. It was about control. And people who feared losing control could become extraordinarily dangerous. Important. By midday, the atmosphere at Highcroft Lodge had grown strained almost beyond endurance. The guests who had remained overnight now moved about the house with quiet caution, as though afraid that ordinary conversation itself might provoke suspicion. Servants whispered in corners, doors closed softly, and every glance seemed burdened with private speculation. Inspector Bartlett spent the morning reviewing Julian Armitage's financial affairs. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that Julian's life had been tangled in debts, resentments, and manipulations extending well beyond the village itself. Yet one detail troubled the inspector more than any other. Julian had planned to leave. People burdened by enemies often fled because they feared danger. But according to Colonel Havers, Julian had appeared confident, almost amused by the situation. That suggested leverage, and leverage implied secrets. Miss Marple sat quietly in the conservatory while Mrs. Bantry paced anxiously beside the orchid tables. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry whispered, "surely Lydia Gray must still be at the center of it." "Secret meetings, blackmail, hidden letters, oh yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Lydia certainly has secrets." "Well then? But frightened women with old love letters rarely construct theatrical murder scenes involving clocks and broken crystals." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Then who would?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the library corridor. "Someone concerned with appearances," she murmured softly. someone accustomed to arranging rooms, conversations, and people. At that moment, Celeste Armitage entered the conservatory carrying herself with composed dignity, though fatigue had begun to show plainly beneath her calm exterior. Important, Inspector Bartlett joined her almost immediately. "Mrs. Armitage," he said quietly, "I would like to discuss your stepson's plans." Celeste looked puzzled. "Plans? We understand Julian intended to leave Highcroft Lodge permanently." For the first time since the investigation began, her composure shifted noticeably. "He mentioned something of the sort recently. You oppose the idea?" "Not particularly." Inspector Bartlett studied her carefully, and financially, a faint pause followed. "Julian depended upon the estate far more than he admitted, but if he left, his share would transfer immediately." "Yes." The inspector folded his arms. "And would that have caused difficulties for the lodge?" Celeste hesitated just slightly too long. "Some," Miss Marple observed her quietly. Not fear, she thought. Calculation. Long-practiced calculation. Inspector Bartlett continued calmly. "Did Julian threaten you in any way?" Celeste looked genuinely offended. "Certainly not." "But you argued yesterday." "Families argue. About money? About irresponsibility?" The inspector said nothing for several moments. Then quietly, "Mrs. Armitage, who adjusted the library after Julian died." The question landed heavily. Celeste's eyes lifted sharply. "I beg your pardon?" The broken decanter, the clock, the chair position. Inspector Bartlett watched her steadily. "Someone arranged that room." A silence settled over the conservatory. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly together. Celeste recovered herself quickly. "Inspector, are you suggesting I tampered with a murder scene?" "I am asking whether you entered the library before the body was discovered." "No." The answer came smoothly, too smoothly perhaps. "Meanwhile, Dr. Important." Fenwick continued examining the objects collected from the library. One item in particular had begun troubling him considerably: the wine from the shattered decanter. When Inspector Bartlett joined him later in the study, the doctor spoke at once. "There's something odd about the brandy. Poison?" "No, dilution." The inspector frowned. "Water?" "Yes, a substantial amount." A silence followed, meaning someone altered the decanter before it was broken. Inspector Bartlett murmured. Miss Marple, who had entered quietly behind them, nodded faintly. "How practical," she said softly. The inspector looked toward her. "Practical?" "Yes. A partially diluted decanter suggests recent use. It helps create the impression of a conversation interrupted by violence." Inspector Bartlett stared at her. "You think the victim never drank from it at all?" "Perhaps not." The inspector leaned slowly against the desk. "So now the decanter, the clock, and even the room arrangement may all be artificial."
"Yeah."
Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the darkened fireplace. "And artificial things are usually placed to distract attention from something real." At that moment the housemaid appeared nervously in the doorway. "Inspector, I found this while cleaning the terrace this morning." She handed him a small silver key. Inspector Bartlett examined it carefully. The library desk. Miss Marple's eyes lifted immediately. "Interesting. Very interesting indeed." The inspector turned sharply toward Celeste Armitage, who had just entered behind the maid. "Who possessed a key to Julian's desk?" Celeste hesitated visibly now. "Julian kept one himself. I had another." "And this?" The maid spoke quietly. "It was near the rose bushes below the terrace wall." "Important." Inspector Bartlett's expression darkened thoughtfully. Someone had discarded it outside after the murder, meaning the desk itself mattered. He unlocked the drawer immediately. Inside lay scattered financial papers, unpaid accounts, and several sealed envelopes tied neatly together with blue ribbon. One envelope bore Lydia Gray's name, another bore Celeste Armitage's, and beneath them all rested a final document half concealed beneath the ledger book. Inspector Bartlett pulled it free slowly. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed at once. Miss Marple watched him carefully. "Ah," she thought softly, "now we begin approaching the truth. because whatever Inspector Bartlett had just discovered, it frightened him far more than the murder itself. Important. Inspector Bartlett remained silent for several moments after reading the document from Julian Armitage's desk. The room itself seemed to tighten around that silence. Dr. Fenwick removed his spectacles slowly, while Miss Marple sat near the window with the quiet patience of someone who already suspected what would come next. At last the inspector folded the paper carefully. "Well," he said grimly, "that changes matters considerably." Dr. Fenwick frowned. "What is it? A revised estate agreement?" Inspector Bartlett's expression darkened. "Signed only 3 days ago." Miss Marple's eyes lifted softly. "How interesting." The inspector glanced toward her briefly before continuing. "If Julian left Highcroft Lodge permanently, control of a significant portion of the estate would transfer immediately." He paused. "Not to Mrs. Armitage." Dr. Fenwick looked surprised. "Then to whom?" Inspector Bartlett lowered the paper slowly. "To Lydia Gray." A heavy silence settled over the study. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Ah, yes," she thought. "Now the fear becomes clearer." Later that afternoon, Lydia Gray was questioned once again, this time in the library itself. She appeared exhausted, the strain of concealment beginning to erode her composure completely. Inspector Bartlett placed the estate document upon the desk between them. "You knew about this." Lydia stared at the paper without speaking. "Miss Gray?" "Yes," she whispered finally. "Explain." Her hands trembled faintly. "Years ago, before Julian became involved with debts and gambling, we intended to marry." Inspector Bartlett watched her carefully. "But the engagement ended." "Yes." "Why?" Lydia lowered her eyes. "Because his family disapproved. Particularly Mrs. Armitage." The inspector made a brief note. "Important. And yet Julian recently altered the estate settlement in your favor." Lydia nodded faintly. "He said he was tired of being controlled." Miss Marple, seated quietly near the fire, studied her thoughtfully. "Not ambition," she reflected. "Reluctance." Inspector Bartlett leaned forward slightly. "So Julian intended to leave the lodge with you?" A long silence followed. "Yes. And Mrs. Armitage knew this?" Lydia hesitated visibly. "I think she suspected." The inspector's expression sharpened immediately. Outside the library, Celeste Armitage stood perfectly still in the corridor. Her face remained composed, but one hand tightened slowly around the carved banister rail. Miss Marple noticed. "Very controlled," she thought softly. "Too controlled." Inspector Bartlett continued calmly. "Miss Gray, why did Julian keep your old letters?" Lydia gave a faint, bitter smile. "Because Julian liked possessing things, even memories, and the blackmail. He threatened exposure only after I refused to leave with him immediately." Her voice tightened painfully. "He wanted complete obedience from everyone around him." The inspector nodded slowly. "A difficult man, a manipulative one, but perhaps not dangerous enough to explain the extraordinary staging afterward." Meanwhile, Dr. Fenwick continued reviewing the physical evidence from the library. One detail increasingly disturbed him. "There's remarkably little sign of struggle," he murmured later to Inspector Bartlett. "Far less than expected from a violent confrontation." The inspector frowned, meaning the victim trusted whoever approached him, or was seated when attacked. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused softly. "How important chairs become in these matters," she murmured. Inspector Bartlett looked sharply toward her. "Important, the overturned chair?" "Yes." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was moved after the attack. We know that already. But perhaps more importantly, it was positioned to suggest sudden movement." The inspector considered this silently. "You think Julian never rose from the desk?" "Perhaps not." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the mantel clock. "And if he remained seated comfortably, then the attacker was someone he felt entirely at ease with." A silence settled over the room. Inspector Bartlett looked slowly toward the library door. "Mrs. Armitage." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said gently, "People who control households become very skilled at controlling appearances also. They arrange flowers, conversations, finances, and occasionally truths." At that moment, the housemaid entered nervously carrying a silver tray. "Beg pardon, sir, but Mrs. Armitage asked whether anyone required tea." Inspector Bartlett stared briefly at the tray before suddenly asking, "Who prepared this?" "The cook, sir." "And Mrs. Armitage?" "She arranged it herself." Miss Marple's eyes lifted immediately toward the untouched teacups. "How thoughtful," she murmured softly. The inspector frowned slightly. But then he noticed something peculiar. One cup had already been filled before the tray entered the room. A tiny detail, yet oddly deliberate. Miss Marple spoke quietly. People accustomed to managing rooms often prepare things automatically. Her eyes remained upon the teacup, even when they are distracted. Inspector Bartlett's expression sharpened gradually. The arranged library, the adjusted clock, the carefully diluted decanter, and now the pre-poured tea. Don't panic. Habit. Long-practiced domestic habit. Important. His gaze shifted slowly toward the corridor where Celeste Armitage still stood just beyond sight. A woman who arranged details instinctively. A woman facing the loss of both control and inheritance. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. "There is another thing," she said softly. Inspector Bartlett looked at her expectantly. "Mrs. Armitage never once asked how Julian died." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Only whether the situation was under control." The silence that followed felt suddenly enormous, because in that single distinction lay something far colder than grief. It revealed priority. Important. That evening, Highcroft Lodge felt less like a country house and more like a stage upon which every occupant waited anxiously for the final act. The servants moved quietly through dim corridors, avoiding unnecessary conversation, while the remaining guests gathered uneasily in small groups that dissolved whenever Inspector Bartlett appeared. Outside, rain had begun falling steadily against the long conservatory windows, softening the gardens into blurred shadows. Miss Marple sat alone near the fire in the drawing room, her knitting resting idle in her lap. A mild expression revealed nothing, yet her thoughts had become increasingly focused upon Celeste Armitage, not because Celeste appeared emotional, but because she did not. People faced with sudden death generally became disordered in small ways. They forgot conversations, misplaced objects, and repeated themselves nervously. Celeste Armitage did none of those things. She remained composed, careful, managed. Inspector Bartlett entered the room shortly after 8, carrying several papers recovered from Julian's desk. "I've reviewed the estate agreement again," he said quietly. Miss Marple looked up gently. "And?" "The financial implications are considerable. If Julian married Lydia Gray or left the estate with her, Mrs. Armitage's control over Highcroft Lodge would diminish almost immediately." Miss Marple nodded softly. "Yes, and for certain personalities, loss of control feels rather like annihilation." The inspector leaned back wearily. "There is still no direct evidence placing her in the library at the time of death." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Only behavior." Inspector Bartlett gave a faint sigh. "Behavior is frustratingly difficult to arrest people for." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Important. Fortunately, human beings often arrest themselves eventually." At that moment, Celeste Armitage entered carrying a silver coffee service. Her elegance remained flawless despite the strain of the past day. "You both look exhausted," she said calmly. "I thought coffee might help." Inspector Bartlett watched her carefully as she arranged the cups upon the table. "Everything is precise. Everything is orderly. Even now." Miss Marple's eyes drifted towards Celeste's hands. Steady hands. Not the hands of a woman overwhelmed by grief. Celeste poured the coffee smoothly. "Any progress, Inspector?" "A little." "How reassuring." Miss Marple accepted her cup gently. "How fortunate," she murmured softly, "that you remain so composed through all this." Celeste's faint smile did not alter. One must remain practical during difficult circumstances. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Practicality can be very useful after sudden violence." For the briefest instant, Celeste's hand paused upon the silver pot. Tiny, almost invisible, but enough. Inspector Bartlett noticed it too. Later that night, Dr. Fenwick requested another examination of the library carpet where the broken decanter had fallen. Inspector Bartlett accompanied him while Miss Marple followed quietly behind. The doctor crouched near the darkened stain beside the desk. "There's something inconsistent here," he murmured. Inspector Bartlett frowned. "The wine? No. The blood?" Miss Marple's eyes lifted at once. Dr. Fenwick pointed carefully toward the edge of the carpet. "The blood pattern suggests Julian collapsed almost immediately after the injury." He looked thoughtfully toward the overturned chair. Yet the chair was knocked sideways afterward. Inspector Bartlett stared. "So the room was rearranged after death." "Important, yes." Miss Marple folded her hands softly. "And not in panic either." The inspector looked toward her sharply. No frightened person carefully stages overturned furniture while adjusting clocks and arranging broken crystal. Her voice remained gentle. "That requires calmness." A silence settled over the library. Then suddenly Inspector Bartlett said quietly, "The maid." Miss Marple glanced toward him. She stated Mrs. Armitage entered the library briefly before the body was discovered. His expression sharpened. "At the time I assumed it was insignificant." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Nothing is insignificant once one begins arranging scenes." Inspector Bartlett turned immediately toward the corridor. Celeste Armitage was no longer in the drawing room. They found her moments later standing alone near the terrace windows overlooking the rain-darkened gardens. She did not appear surprised to see them. Inspector Bartlett spoke calmly. "You entered the library before Miss Gray discovered the body." Celeste remained silent briefly. "Yeah, why?" "I heard raised voices earlier and became concerned. And you found Julian dead." Another pause. "And yes." Inspector Bartlett stepped closer. "But instead of calling for help, you rearranged the room." For the first time, real emotion flickered across her face. Not fear. Offense. "How absurd." "The clock," said the inspector quietly. "The decanter. The chair." Celeste looked away toward the rain. Miss Marple spoke gently from behind them. "You wanted the scene to appear chaotic, emotional. Perhaps connected to Lydia Gray." Celeste's composure tightened visibly. "You have no proof." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But one thing has troubled me from the beginning." Celeste turned slowly toward her. "Important." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "When the body was discovered, everyone rushed toward Julian immediately." She paused. "Everyone except you." A silence followed. "You stood perfectly still beside the piano for several seconds before entering the library." Celeste said nothing. Miss Marple's eyes remained kind but unwavering. "That is not how people behave when they discover tragedy unexpectedly. It is how they behave when they are already preparing themselves for what they know they will find." The room fell utterly silent except for the rain against the glass, and for the first time since the investigation began, Celeste Armitage looked genuinely uncertain. "Important." Celeste Armitage's uncertainty lasted only a moment before her composure returned. Yet the brief crack in her calm demeanor altered the atmosphere at Highcroft Lodge immediately. Inspector Bartlett saw it, Miss Marple saw it, and perhaps most importantly, Celeste herself realized they had seen it. The balance within the house had shifted. Rain continued steadily through the night, rattling softly against the terrace windows while the remaining guests withdrew uneasily to their rooms. No one spoke openly anymore about Julian Armitage's death, yet suspicion lingered heavily through every corridor and drawing room like the lingering scent of extinguished candles. Inspector Bartlett remained awake in the study, reviewing the statements again. The pattern had become increasingly clear. Celeste Armitage had a motive. She had an opportunity. And she had almost certainly manipulated the library afterward. Yet something still resisted final certainty. Miss Marple entered quietly shortly after midnight, carrying a shawl around her shoulders. "You are troubled," she observed gently. Inspector Bartlett looked up tiredly. She staged the room. "I am nearly certain of it." "But?" The inspector leaned back slowly. "But staging after a death is not identical to committing murder." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Very true." The inspector rubbed one hand across his forehead. "If Julian was already dead when she entered the library, then everything changes again. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fire. Yes, and people who control appearances are often tempted to improve unpleasant realities, even when they are innocent of causing them. A silence followed. Then Inspector Bartlett said thoughtfully, "You still believe the original violence itself may have been impulsive, important?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Very much so." The inspector frowned slightly. "But everyone connected to Julian seems tangled in long resentments and financial pressure." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Which means we must distinguish carefully between people who wanted Julian controlled and people who wanted him dead." At that moment, footsteps sounded hurriedly in the corridor outside. The housemaid appeared pale and breathless. "Inspector, Miss Gray is gone." Both Inspector Bartlett and Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Gone? Gone?" the inspector repeated. "She's not in her room, sir." And the terrace door downstairs was left open. Inspector Bartlett moved at once. Outside, the rain had eased into mist, leaving the gardens dark and glistening beneath weak moonlight. Footprints crossed the damp gravel path leading toward the old rose arbor near the lower lawn. They found Lydia Gray there moments later. She stood beneath the arbor trembling visibly, one hand pressed against the stone pillar as though struggling to remain steady. Inspector Bartlett approached carefully. "Miss Gray." She looked up with frightened eyes. "I didn't kill him," she whispered immediately. "No one has accused you." "But they will." Miss Marple stepped gently beside her. "My dear," she said softly, running away rarely improves appearances. Lydia gave a faint, broken laugh. "I wasn't running." "Then why come here?" For several seconds Lydia remained silent. Then slowly she reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded letter. Inspector Bartlett took it carefully. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Julian Armitage. The letter had been written only hours before the recital. "Meet me in the library after the final performance. Important. There are matters we must settle before tonight ends. If you refuse again, I shall tell Celeste everything." Inspector Bartlett looked up sharply. "Everything?" Lydia closed her eyes briefly. There were more than old letters. Miss Marple remained very still. Lydia's voice trembled faintly now. "Years ago, before Julian and I separated, we planned to marry secretly. Celeste discovered it and forced the engagement to end." She swallowed hard. "But recently Julian learned something about her." Inspector Bartlett's attention sharpened immediately. "What?" Lydia hesitated visibly. "The estate finances." Her voice lowered. Money had been disappearing from Highcroft Lodge for years. Julian believed Celeste falsified accounts to preserve the estate. A heavy silence settled beneath the arbor. Inspector Bartlett unfolded the letter again slowly. "So Julian intended a confrontation?" "Yes." "And you believe he threatened Celeste with exposure?" Lydia nodded faintly. Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the distant lights of the lodge. "Ah, yes. Now the fear becomes complete." Inspector Bartlett spoke quietly. "You told no one this before?" "I was frightened." Lydia looked exhausted. If Julian exposed her publicly, everything at Highcroft Lodge would collapse. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Not guilt. Protectiveness. Old protectiveness. Toward Celeste, perhaps, or toward the house itself. Inspector Bartlett folded the letter carefully. "This gives Mrs. Armitage a far stronger motive." "Yes," Lydia whispered. Miss Marple looked gently toward her. "But motive alone is rarely enough." Lydia stared at her uncertainly. Miss Marple continued softly. "Tell me, my dear. When you entered the library and discovered Julian, was Mrs. Armitage already there?" "Important." The question landed like a sudden chill. Lydia's expression changed instantly. Fear, recognition, and something dangerously close to pity. For several long seconds she could not answer. Then at last, very quietly, "Yes." Inspector Bartlett stared at her. "She was standing beside the desk," Lydia whispered, "and the clock had already stopped." "Important." The confession beneath the rose arbor changed the investigation with startling speed. By dawn, Inspector Bartlett had returned to Highcroft Lodge with a far clearer understanding of what had occurred after Julian Armitage's death. But the central question remained unresolved. Had Celeste Armitage merely staged the scene, or had she committed the murder itself? The distinction mattered enormously. Miss Marple sat quietly in the morning room while rain clouds drifted low across the hills beyond the terrace. The house itself felt strangely hollow now, as though everyone inside sensed that the final truth stood very near. Inspector Bartlett paced slowly beside the fireplace. Lydia Gray confirmed Celeste was already in the library when she entered, he said. The clock had stopped. The room is partially arranged. Miss Marple nodded softly. Yes, so Celeste lied repeatedly. Turned. The inspector stopped pacing abruptly. But still no one witnessed the actual attack. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently together. Because the attack itself was probably very simple. Inspector Bartlett frowned. Simple? Oh yes. Most fatal moments are. Her eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the rain-streaked windows. Human beings expect murder to resemble theater. In reality, it often resembles exhaustion. At that moment, Celeste Armitage entered the room. She looked composed as always, though fatigue now shadowed her features more visibly. She glanced calmly from Miss Marple to the inspector. I understand Miss Gray has changed her story. Inspector Bartlett studied her steadily. She claims you were already in the library before the body was discovered. Celeste remained silent briefly. Yes? And you still insist you found Julian already dead? Yes. Important. Inspector Bartlett stepped closer, then explained the alterations afterward. For the first time, Celeste's voice sharpened slightly. Because I panicked, the answer hung heavily in the room. Miss Marple looked up gently. At last, she murmured softly, something truthful. Celeste's composure tightened again immediately. Inspector Bartlett folded his arms. You admit staging the scene? Yes. The clock? Yes. The decanter and furniture? Yes. Why? Celeste closed her eyes briefly. Because Lydia was there. Her voice lowered. And because Julian had spent years destroying people's lives through manipulation and humiliation. I knew suspicion would fall naturally upon her. A silence followed. Inspector Bartlett spoke quietly. So you attempted to guide the investigation? Yes. Miss Marple observed her thoughtfully. Still controlled, she reflected, but now exhausted too. Inspector Bartlett resumed carefully. When you entered the library, what exactly did you see? Celeste hesitated only slightly. Julian was beside the desk. The chair had fallen. There was blood on the carpet. Her eyes lowered faintly. And Colonel Havers was standing near the fireplace. The room went completely still. Inspector Bartlett stared. Colonel Havers? Celeste nodded slowly. He looked shocked, truly shocked. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Bartlett moved immediately toward the door. Where is the Colonel now? In the smoking room, Celeste replied quietly. Minutes later, Colonel Havers stood facing Inspector Bartlett beneath the dark wood paneling of the smoking room. He appeared older now than he had during the recital, as though the strain of concealment had finally begun wearing through him. Important. You were in the library before the body was discovered, Inspector Bartlett said calmly. The Colonel looked toward the fire without answering. Mrs. Armitage saw you there. A long silence followed. Then quietly. Yes. Inspector Bartlett's expression hardened. Explain. The Colonel gave a faint sigh. I came to speak with Julian after the performance. He had been pressing Celeste about the estate accounts for weeks. And when you entered, he was alive. Inspector Bartlett narrowed his eyes. Alive? Yes, angry, drunk, and shouting. The Colonel's jaw tightened faintly. He accused Celeste of ruining his inheritance. He threatened a public scandal. The inspector listened carefully. Then what happened? I tried to calm him. And? The Colonel's voice lowered. He struck me first. A silence settled heavily across the room. Inspector Bartlett spoke quietly. You fought. Yes. Briefly. Yes. And during this struggle, Julian suffered a fatal injury. The Colonel looked away. He stumbled against the corner of the desk. Inspector Bartlett remained silent. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing room, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Through the open doorway she could hear fragments of the Colonel's confession drifting faintly from the smoking room. Yet something still troubled her deeply. Not the fight, not the panic afterward, but the timing, always the timing. Her eyes drifted slowly toward the library clock visible through the corridor. 9:23. Stopped deliberately. Why that exact moment? Then suddenly she remembered something Lydia Gray had said earlier beneath the arbor. "Meet me in the library after the final performance." After the final performance. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Important. The recital had not ended at 9:23. It ended nearly 15 minutes later. A soft sigh escaped her. "Oh dear," she murmured quietly. Because at last she understood the final deception. Someone had not merely altered the scene afterward. Someone had altered the timeline itself. And that meant one of the confessions already given could not possibly be true. Important. That evening, Inspector Bartlett gathered the remaining guests and household members inside the drawing room at Highcroft Lodge. Rain still whispered softly against the windows, while the fire burned low beneath the marble mantelpiece. The elegant room that had hosted music and polite conversation only 2 nights earlier now carried the heavy stillness of approaching truth. Celeste Armitage sat near the piano with quiet composure, though fatigue had finally dulled the sharp certainty she had maintained throughout the investigation. Colonel Havers stood near the fireplace, rigid and pale. Lydia Gray remained close to the terrace doors, visibly anxious but calmer than before, as though secrecy itself had exhausted her more than fear. Miss Marple occupied her usual modest chair near the window, knitting folded peacefully in her lap. Inspector Bartlett looked slowly around the room. "We now understand much of what occurred after Julian Armitage's death," he said calmly. "Mrs. Armitage admits altering the library scene. The clock was stopped deliberately, the decanter broken afterward, and the furniture rearranged to create an impression of violent chaos." Celeste lowered her eyes faintly. But despite those deceptions, the inspector continued. One important question remained unresolved: when exactly Julian died. Miss Marple lifted her gaze gently. "And that," she murmured softly, "is where human beings once again complicated matters by trying to improve reality." Inspector Bartlett nodded slightly toward her. Miss Marple observed something extremely important. The stopped clock showed 9:23. He paused. Yet the final recital performance did not end until nearly 9:38. A silence settled across the room. Important. Lydia Gray looked confused immediately. "But Julian's letter asked me to meet him after the final performance." "Exactly," said Miss Marple quietly. Inspector Bartlett turned slowly toward Colonel Havers. "Which means your account cannot be accurate." The Colonel's face tightened visibly. "You claim to confront Julian in the library after the recital ended." The inspector's voice hardened slightly. "But if the clock was stopped at 9:23 before the performance even concluded, then the scene had already been arranged before most guests left the drawing room." A heavy silence followed. Colonel Havers looked suddenly older, the remaining strength draining visibly from his expression. Celeste stared at him in shock. Miss Marple spoke softly. "You lied to protect someone." The Colonel closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Inspector Bartlett stepped forward. "Whom?" For several seconds Colonel Havers said nothing at all. Then quietly, "Celeste." The room remained utterly still. Celeste looked toward him sharply. "Richard," he raised one hand faintly. "No." It must end properly now. Inspector Bartlett waited. The Colonel's voice roughened slightly. "I entered the library before the recital finished because Celeste had gone there after Julian left the drawing room. I suspected another argument concerning the estate." He swallowed heavily. "When I arrived, Julian was already dead." Celeste closed her eyes briefly. The inspector spoke quietly. "And Mrs. Armitage confessed what happened?" "Yes." A long silence followed. Miss Marple's expression remained gentle but unwavering. "It was not planned," she said softly. Celeste finally looked up. "No," she whispered, "it wasn't." Inspector Bartlett turned toward her carefully. "Tell us exactly what happened." "Important." For the first time since the investigation began, Celeste Armitage seemed to abandon the careful control she had maintained for so long. "Julian confronted me in the library before the final performance ended," she said quietly. "He had discovered discrepancies in the estate accounts and threatened public exposure unless I surrendered control of Highcroft Lodge entirely." Her hands tightened together faintly. "He said the house would be sold within the year." Lydia Gray lowered her gaze sadly. Celeste continued in a strained voice. "You do not understand what Highcroft means to this village, to the staff, to everything my husband built." She looked toward the fire. "Julian would have destroyed it all out of spite." Inspector Bartlett remained silent. We argued. Her composure trembled slightly now. "He laughed at me, said I had spent years pretending to manage a life already collapsing." She closed her eyes briefly. Then he moved toward the desk to take the account papers. And? Celeste's voice became almost inaudible. "I struck him with the bronze horse from the mantel." The silence that followed felt enormous. "It happened so quickly," she whispered. "He fell against the desk corner and never moved again." Colonel Havers lowered his head heavily. "When I entered moments later," he said quietly, "Celeste was trying to stop the clock." Inspector Bartlett frowned slightly. "Why the clock?" Celeste gave a faint, broken laugh. "Because I wanted time itself to appear uncertain." Her eyes filled at last with exhausted grief. If the timeline became confused, perhaps suspicion would scatter elsewhere. Miss Marple looked at her sadly. "Yes," she said softly, "and frightened people often believe confusion will save them." Celeste looked toward her. "Important. I never meant to kill him." "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "Most people never do." Inspector Bartlett stepped forward quietly. "Mrs. Armitage, I must ask you to come with me." Celeste nodded once without resistance. As the inspector guided her toward the door, the drawing room seemed to exhale the tension it had carried since the night of the recital. Lydia Gray sat trembling silently near the terrace, while Colonel Havers stared into the dying fire with exhausted defeat. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and moved toward the window overlooking the rain-darkened gardens. "How sad it always is," she murmured softly, "when people convince themselves that control is the same thing as safety." Mrs. Bantry, standing quietly nearby, whispered, "And all because of a stopped clock." Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. "Oh no, my dear, the clock merely revealed what was already there." Her eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the empty library corridor beyond. "In the end, it is nearly always fear that stops people, not time."